Jack Callahan had spent 22 years behind the wheel of his semi-truck, hauling cargo across every state in the continental US. After 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine, the open road had become his therapy, his sanctuary. He'd witnessed the country change through his windshield, endless desert highways shimmering with heat mirages, mountain passes shrouded in mist, small towns fading and new ones blooming along interstate exits. He'd encountered stranded travelers, wildlife, wandering onto highways and weather systems that transformed familiar routes into alien landscapes. But nothing in his 2 decades on the road, or even his years in combat zones, could have prepared him for what awaited him on this rain-soaked autumn night on a forgotten stretch of Highway 16. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a grey curtain that reduced visibility to mere yards ahead of his headlights. Jack adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his scarred knuckles whitening slightly with the pressure. His GPS had suggested a detour to avoid flooding on his usual route, leading him onto this lesser-traveled highway cutting through dense woodland. At 48, Jack had developed an almost supernatural sense for dangerous road conditions, and tonight every instinct was on high alert. "Steady does it," he muttered to himself, a habit formed during long solo hauls. His deadline for delivering this shipment of medical supplies to Memorial Hospital wasn't for another 14 hours, but the unexpected detour had him running behind schedule. Still, better late than never arriving at all, a lesson he'd learned the hard way, both in the Marines and on America's highways. The cabin of his Peterbilt 389 was a carefully maintained space, everything in its place. A small American flag was pinned to the dashboard next to a faded photograph of his unit. A steel thermos of black coffee sat in the cup holder, half empty now after 6 hours on the road. The radio crackled with static as it lost reception in this remote stretch, the weather report cutting in and out with warnings of flash flooding and wind advisories. Advised to seek shelter until morning. The radio sputtered before dying completely. Jack reached over and shut it off with a sigh. The silence amplified the drumming of rain on the roof and the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. His headlights illuminated the reflective paint on the center line, the asphalt slick and dark as an oil spill, the woods pressed close on either side, creating a tunnel of darkness broken only by his high beams. As he rounded a bend, slowing, to navigate the increasingly treacherous conditions, something caught his eye. A faint, incongruous splash of color just off the shoulder of the road. Jack narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slightly. At first, he thought it might be trash blown by the wind, or perhaps discarded camping gear. Then he saw movement. Jack's combat instincts kicked in immediately. He eased off the accelerator, scanning the area while calculating risks. In his years on the road, he'd heard stories of highway robberies staged with injured people as bait. But something about this felt different. He slowed the massive truck, carefully pulling onto the shoulder and engaging his hazard lights. The bright orange flashes illuminated the surrounding trees in strobing bursts. Jack reached for the heavy-duty flashlight he kept within arm's reach and his locked glove compartment where he kept his service pistol, a habit he'd never broken despite years of peaceful driving. "Better safe than sorry," he murmured, sliding the weapon into his jacket pocket without taking it out of its holster. He grabbed his rain slicker from behind the seat and shrugged it on, pulling the hood up over his close-cropped salt and pepper hair. The moment he opened the door, the sounds of the storm amplified. Wind howling through the trees, rain hammering against metal and asphalt. Jack descended from the cab carefully, boots landing heavily in a puddle. The cold water immediately seeped through the seams, a familiar discomfort that brought back memories of rain-soaked patrols. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he moved toward the splash of color he'd spotted. The rain stung his face, driven sideways by gusts of wind that bent the surrounding pines. 20 yards from his truck, Jack finally saw clearly what had caught his attention. A young woman lay crumpled at the base of an embankment, her red jacket stark against the dark mud. She was motionless, half submerged in a rapidly forming pool of rainwater flowing down from the road. A small backpack had spilled open nearby, contents scattered and sinking into the mud. "Hey!" Jack called out, quickening his pace. "Can you hear me?" No response. Jack crouched beside her, immediately checking for a pulse at her neck while shielding her face from the rain with his body. Her skin was cold, but a faint, thready pulse beat beneath his fingertips. Relief washed through him. She was alive. Her dark hair was plastered to her pale face, and a nasty gash across her forehead suggested she'd fallen down the embankment, likely after being disoriented in the storm. Training took over. Jack carefully assessed her for spinal injuries before gently turning her onto her back. She was young, maybe early 20s, dressed inadequately for the weather in jeans, sneakers, and the lightweight red jacket. No visible signs of other trauma beyond the head wound, but hypothermia was a real danger in these conditions. "Miss, can you hear me?" Jack tried again, tapping her cheek lightly. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. A faint moan escaped her lips. Semi-conscious, at least. Jack looked back at his truck, calculating. The nearest hospital was at least 30 miles away, according to his GPS, and cell service was non-existent in this stretch. He needed to get her warm and dry immediately. "I'm going to help you," he said clearly, on the off chance she could hear him. "I'm a truck driver. Former Marine. You're safe." Decision made, Jack gathered the scattered belongings he could reach. A cell phone with a cracked screen, what looked like a student ID card, a set of keys, and a small wallet, and stuffed them into her backpack. He hoisted it onto one shoulder, then carefully slid his arms beneath the young woman, lifting her with practiced ease. She was lighter than expected, her form slight against his broad chest as he carried her back toward the idling truck. The wind picked up, driving the rain. Nearly horizontally now, Jack hunched his shoulders, shielding the unconscious woman as best he could while navigating back to his vehicle. By the time he reached the passenger side, they were both drenched despite his rain gear. With careful maneuvering, Jack managed to open the door while still supporting her weight. He placed her gently in the passenger seat, reclining it slightly before securing the seatbelt around her. The cab's interior light illuminated her face fully for the first time, young, with features that suggested mixed heritage, perhaps Asian and Caucasian. The gash on her forehead was still seeping blood, though not dangerously so. Jack climbed back into the driver's seat, cranking the heater to full blast. He reached behind his seat for his emergency kit, pulling out a small first aid box. As a veteran who'd seen his share of field injuries, Jack kept supplies that went well beyond the standard road safety kit. "Let's take care of that cut first," he murmured, opening an antiseptic wipe. As he gently cleaned the wound on her forehead, her eyelids fluttered again, but she remained unconscious. Jack applied a butterfly bandage to hold the edges of the cut together, then covered it with gauze and medical tape. Next priority, dry clothes. Jack always kept spare clothing in his truck for long hauls. He reached into the storage compartment behind the seats and pulled out a clean flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants. The ethical dilemma of changing an unconscious woman's clothes wasn't lost on him. Jack decided to compromise. He carefully removed her soaked red jacket and covered her upper body with the flannel shirt over her existing clothes, then draped a heavy emergency blanket from his kit around her lower half. It wasn't ideal, but it would help prevent her condition from worsening until she regained consciousness or they reached help. With her immediate needs addressed, Jack turned his attention to figuring out who she was. The backpack sat between, in them dripping onto the rubber floor mats. He hesitated only briefly before opening it. This wasn't about curiosity. He needed to know if she had medical conditions, emergency contacts, anything that might help him get her proper care. The contents were sparse. A few textbooks suggesting she was a college student, a half-empty water bottle, a protein bar, and a small makeup bag. Jack found the wallet he'd collected from the ground and carefully opened it, looking for identification. He found a student ID card for Western State University, about 40 miles north. The name on the card read Emily Chen, matching the face of the unconscious woman beside him, though the photo showed her smiling brightly, a stark contrast to her current state. Jack continued his search, finding a driver's license with the same name. According to the ID, she was 22 years old and lived in Riverside, the university town. He was about to close the wallet when something slipped from between the cards. A military-dependent ID card, the kind issued to family members of active duty personnel. Out of professional courtesy, Jack glanced at it, expecting to see her listed as someone's daughter. But when he read the name of the service member she was connected to, his blood ran cold. His hands began to tremble slightly as he stared at the familiar name, memories flooding back with such force that for a moment, the storm outside disappeared. Entirely, Lieutenant Colonel Victor Chen Jack Callahan hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 15 years, but he saw it in his nightmares regularly. The last time he'd seen Victor Chen had been in a remote valley in Afghanistan's Kunar province, a day that had ended with Jack receiving both a Purple Heart and the burden of a secret he'd carried like a stone in his chest ever since. And now, by some twist of fate that seemed too calculated to be coincidence, Victor Chen's daughter lay unconscious in the passenger seat of his truck. Jack's mind raced through possibilities. Could this be a setup? Had Chen somehow engineered this encounter, or was it truly random? The universe's dark sense of humor placing the daughter of the man whose life he'd ruined directly in his path. A soft moan from Emily pulled Jack back to the present. Her immediate safety took precedence over the ghosts of his past. He tucked the IDs back into her wallet and returned it to her backpack. Whatever connection existed between them, whatever cosmic joke was being played at his expense, the first priority was getting her medical attention. Jack put the truck in gear, carefully pulling back onto the slick highway. As the wipers fought against the relentless rain, his mind was already mapping out the nearest hospitals while simultaneously trying to process this impossible coincidence. "Hang in there, Emily," he said quietly, accelerating cautiously through the storm. "I've got you." What he didn't say, what he couldn't yet bring himself to acknowledge, was the weight of those words, because 15 years ago, he'd made a similar promise to her father, a promise he'd failed to keep. The truck's headlights carved a narrow, path through the darkness as Jack navigated the treacherous highway. His windshield wipers worked frantically against the downpour, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. Every few seconds, his eyes darted to Emily Chen, still unconscious in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow but steady. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Chen's daughter. The coincidence felt impossible, too precise to be random. In Afghanistan, Chen had been Jack's commanding officer during his third and final tour, a brilliant tactician renowned for his measured decision-making under pressure. They hadn't been friends exactly, but there had been mutual respect until that final mission. Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing himself to focus on the road. The past wouldn't help Emily now. According to the GPS, they were still 25 miles from the nearest hospital in Greenfield. In good weather, that would be a quick drive. In this storm, with flooded roads and wind gusts strong enough to buffet even his 18-wheeler, it could take an hour or more. A fallen branch appeared suddenly in his high beams. Jack swerved slightly, careful not to overcorrect on the slick asphalt. The movement caused Emily to stir, a soft groan escaping, her lips as her head lolled against the window. "Emily, can you hear me?" Jack called, keeping his eyes on the road. No response, just another faint moan before she settled back into stillness. Jack reached over and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. The heater was working overtime, filling the cab with warmth. But her clothes beneath were still damp. He needed to get her proper medical attention soon. As if responding to his thoughts, the GPS screen flickered. "Rerouting," the automated voice announced. "Road closure ahead due to flooding." "Perfect," Jack muttered. The detour added another 15 minutes to the journey, taking them even deeper into unfamiliar territory. He'd been driving long enough to know that GPS systems often missed important details in rural areas, especially during extreme weather events. He reached for his CB radio, tuning to the emergency channel. "Breaker 19, this is Nighthawk. Anyone got eyes on Route 16 toward Greenfield?" "Over." Static crackled for a moment before a voice responded. "Nighthawk, this is Sandman. Route 16 is underwater at the Miller Creek Bridge. State troopers have it blocked off. You're gonna want to take County Road 22 north, then cut east on Willowbrook. Over. Copy that, Sandman. Got a medical situation. Know if Greenfield Memorial is still accessible? Over." "That's affirmative. Emergency services are strained, but operational. Drive safe out there. Over." "Much appreciated." Over and out. Jack adjusted his route mentally, weighing options. The detour would add precious minutes, but attempting to navigate flooded roads would be even more dangerous. A flash of lightning illuminated the cab, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very frame of the truck. The sudden noise caused Emily to jerk awake, her eyes flying open in panic. Where am I?" she gasped, struggling against the seatbelt. "Easy, easy," Jack said, keeping his voice calm and steady, the same tone he'd used with spooked new recruits. "In combat zones. You're safe. I found you unconscious by the roadside. I'm taking you to a hospital." Emily's eyes darted around the cab, taking in her surroundings with growing alarm. Her hand flew to the bandage on her forehead, wincing as her fingers made contact with the wound. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, distrustful. "Name's Jack Callahan. I'm a truck driver, former Marine." He deliberately left out any mention of her father. "Can you tell me what happened? How you ended up on the side of the road?" Emily's brow furrowed as she struggled to piece together memories. "I was driving back to campus. My car hydroplaned, I think. Spun out." She closed her eyes briefly. "I remember hitting the guardrail, then nothing." "Your car?" Jack asked. I didn't see one near where I found you. It must be up on the road somewhere. I think I crawled up the embankment trying to flag someone down. Then everything went black. Her voice trembled slightly, either from cold or shock or both. Jack nodded. It was a common enough scenario in accidents. Victims often walked away from crash sites in a daze before collapsing. We'll call the state troopers once we get cell service. Let them know about your car. Right now, we need to get you checked. Out by a doctor? That's a nasty cut on your head. Emily reached for her backpack, which sat on the floor between them. My phone. The screen was cracked when I found it. Battery's probably dead by now, too. She rummaged through the bag anyway, confirming his assessment with a disappointed sigh. Then she froze, her hand still inside the backpack. Jack knew she'd discovered that her wallet had been opened. You went through my things. The accusation in her voice was clear. Jack kept his eyes on the road, had to identify you. Figure out if you had any medical conditions I should know about, any emergency contacts. Emily slowly withdrew her wallet, opening it to check the contents. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but still wary. You're taking me to Greenfield Hospital. That's the plan, though this storm is making it complicated. We've got a detour ahead. She nodded, seeming to accept this. For a few minutes, silence filled the cab, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain and the rhythmic swish of wipers. Jack could feel her studying him, likely assessing whether he was a threat or genuinely trying to help. Thank you, she finally said, for stopping. Most people wouldn't have. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to respond. If she knew who he was, what had happened between him and her father, gratitude would be the last thing on her mind. Another lightning strike illuminated the sky closer this time. The subsequent thunder came almost immediately, a booming crack that suggested the storm was intensifying rather than passing. This weather is insane, Emily murmured, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She glanced out the window, where sheets of rain made visibility nearly impossible beyond the reach of the headlights. Didn't think it was supposed to get this bad. Weather forecasts are never reliable in mountain valleys, Jack replied, grateful for the neutral topic. I've been driving these routes for over 20 years, seen sunny days turn to blizzards in under an hour. Emily nodded, then winced, the movement clearly aggravating her head injury. You said you were a Marine? Jack tensed imperceptibly. Yes. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Got out in 2008. My father was a Marine, she said, and Jack felt his stomach tighten. Lieutenant Colonel, he served in Afghanistan too. Jack focused intently on the road, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. This was the moment. He could acknowledge knowing Victor Chen, or pretend ignorance. The ethical choice seemed clear, but something held him back. What purpose would it serve to tell her now, in her vulnerable state? Would it help either of them? Is that right? He replied non-committally. Small world. Before Emily could respond, the truck's headlights illuminated something in the road ahead. A massive tree had fallen across both lanes, its upper branches still swaying in the wind. Hold on, Jack warned, applying the brakes carefully. The big rig slowed on the wet asphalt, coming to a stop about 20 feet from the obstruction. Damn it! Emily leaned forward, peering through the windshield. Can we go around it? Jack assessed the situation. The shoulders on both sides were soft with mud, a dangerous prospect for a vehicle of this size and weight. Getting stuck would leave them stranded for hours, possibly longer given the strain on emergency services. Not in this rig, he said grimly. We'd sink into that mud up to the axles. He reached for the CB radio again. Breaker 19, this is Nighthawk again. We've got a downed tree blocking both lanes on Route 16, about 10 miles east of the junction with County Road 22. Anyone copy? Static answered him. Jack tried twice more before giving up. Storm must be interfering with the signal. Emily shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. The adrenaline from waking up in a strange vehicle seemed to be wearing off, replaced by the pain from her injuries. So what do we do now? Jack considered their options. There's a truck stop about 5 miles. Back. They'll have a landline, food, better first aid supplies. We can wait out the storm there, call for road assistance. Emily nodded, then hesitated. My dad, he'll be worried. I was supposed to call him when I got back to campus. The mention of Victor Chen sent another jolt through Jack's system. He kept his expression neutral as he carefully maneuvered the truck into a 3-point turn on the narrow highway. Once we get to the truck stop, you can call him. Let him know you're okay. The prospect of Emily contacting her father created a new complication. Victor Chen would want to know who was helping his daughter, and Emily would inevitably mention Jack's name. Would Chen remember? Of course he would. Some names you never forgot, especially when they were attached to the worst day of your career. As Jack completed the turn and headed back the way they'd come, Emily suddenly clutched her head, doubling over with a gasp of pain. Emily? Jack asked sharply, alarmed by her sudden distress. Just dizzy, she managed, her voice strained. The world's spinning. Jack recognized the symptoms immediately. Possible concussion, perhaps worsening. His concern for her immediate health overrode any worries about eventual confrontations with her father. Try to stay awake, he instructed, picking up speed as much as safety allowed. Talk to me. Tell me about school. What are you studying? Emily straightened slowly, keeping her eyes closed. Environmental engineering, she replied, her words slightly slurred. Senior year. That's impressive, Jack said, genuinely meaning it. Why'd you choose that field? As Emily started to explain something about sustainable water systems, Jack divided his attention between her words and the road. The fact that she could still carry on a coherent conversation was reassuring, but her deteriorating condition lent new urgency to their situation. The 5 miles back to the truck stop felt interminable. Jack kept Emily talking, asking questions about her studies, her friends, anything to keep her conscious and engaged. He carefully avoided any mention of her father or his own military service, steering the conversation toward neutral topics whenever it drifted too close to dangerous territory. Finally, the lights of the truck stop appeared through the rain, a small oasis of fluorescent brightness in the stormy darkness. The sign read, Last Chance Truck Stop and Diner, which struck Jack as unnervingly appropriate given their circumstances. The parking lot was surprisingly full, other truckers and travelers obviously having sought refuge from the storm. Jack maneuvered his rig into one of the few remaining spaces large enough to accommodate it. We're here, he told Emily, who had fallen silent during the last mile, though she remained conscious. Let's get you inside. Get that head looked at properly. As Jack shut off the engine, he caught sight of a black SUV with government plates parked near the diner entrance. Something about it triggered his instincts. A holdover from combat, perhaps, or the heightened awareness that came from years, navigating America's highways alone. The vehicle seemed out of place in this remote truck stop. Jack dismissed the thought as paranoia born from the knowledge of who Emily's father was. The government vehicle was likely just state troopers or emergency management personnel dealing with the storm. "Can you walk?" he asked Emily. She nodded weakly. "I think so." Jack climbed down from the cab and circled around to help her, opening the passenger door and supporting her as she carefully stepped down. The rain had lessened slightly, but the wind remained fierce, cutting through their clothes. With his arm around her waist for support, Jack guided Emily toward the diner entrance. As they approached, a man stepped out through the glass doors, silhouetted against the bright interior. Something in his stance, the alert stillness, the calculated assessment, sent warning signals through Jack's nervous system. This wasn't a stranded traveler or a state trooper. This was something else entirely. And in that moment, Jack realized their situation had just become far more complicated than a simple rescue in a storm. The shadow from the past. The man stood motionless in the doorway, water beading on his dark leather jacket. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a military bearing that Jack recognized instantly. The kind of posture that wasn't taught but absorbed through years of service. His face remained partially shadowed, but Jack could make out sharp features and close-cropped hair. One hand remained casually near his hip, where Jack suspected a concealed weapon rested. "Emily!" the man called, his voice carrying over the wind and rain. "Thank God!" Emily tensed against Jack's supporting arm, her confusion evident. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice weak but wary. The man stepped forward into the full glow of the exterior lights. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen combat. "Your father sent me to find you. You weren't answering your phone." Jack's instincts shifted into high alert. Something felt wrong. The timing was too convenient, the explanation too neat. He'd spent enough time in combat zones to recognize when a situation didn't add up. "Who are you?" Jack asked, subtly shifting his stance to place himself slightly more between Emily and the stranger. The man's eyes flicked to Jack, assessing him with cool efficiency. "Special Agent Harrington, private security." He reached slowly into his jacket. Jack tensed and withdrew. A leather ID wallet, flipping it open to reveal credentials. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen contracted our firm when his daughter didn't check in. We pinged her phone's last location." Jack studied the credentials from a distance. They looked legitimate, but in his experience, that meant little. During his service, he'd seen Taliban fighters with perfect replicas of American military IDs. Emily swayed slightly against him, clearly struggling to process this development through her concussion. "My dad hired security to find me? That's extreme, even for him. You know your father," Harrington said with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "When it comes to your safety, he doesn't take chances." He extended a hand toward Emily. "Let's get you out of this weather. A medical team is en route." Jack didn't move. "She needs a hospital. She has a head injury, possible concussion. Which is why we've arranged for a medical evacuation team," Harrington countered smoothly. "They'll be here within 20 minutes. Military-grade care, far better than what the local hospital can provide with their resources stretched thin during this storm." The explanation was reasonable, logical even. Victor Chen had the connections to arrange such services for his daughter, yet something in Harrington's manner kept Jack rooted in place. "That's very efficient," Jack observed, his tone neutral, "especially considering Emily just regained consciousness in my truck less than half an hour ago. No one knew her condition until then." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Harrington's face before his professional mask returned. "We've been tracking her phone since she missed her check-in. When the signal stopped moving and she didn't answer our calls, we mobilized immediately. The colonel has protocols in place." Jack had served under Victor Chen long enough to know this rang true. Chen had always been meticulous about contingency planning, sometimes to the point of paranoia. It was what had made him both an effective commander and a difficult one. Emily shifted uncomfortably beside Jack. "I need to sit down," she murmured. "Of course," Harrington said immediately. "My colleague has secured a private room inside. You'll be comfortable there until the medical team arrives." Jack hesitated, torn between his instinctive distrust and Emily's obvious need for rest. The diner was warm, dry, and certainly better than standing in the rain. At the very least, they could assess the situation better from inside. "Lead the way," Jack finally said, continuing to support Emily as they followed Harrington through the glass doors. The interior of the truck stop was exactly what Jack expected. Vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, the smell of coffee and grease hanging in the air. A handful of truckers occupied tables, their conversations creating a low background hum. Behind the counter, a tired-looking waitress poured coffee for a customer while keeping one eye on the small TV mounted in the corner, which was displaying weather alerts. Harrington led them past the main dining area toward a door marked private. Jack noted a second man sitting at a table near this door. Similar build to Harrington, same alertness, different face. The man nodded almost imperceptibly as they passed. The private room turned out to be a small lounge, likely reserved for staff breaks or perhaps the owner's office. A worn couch lined one wall with a small table and several chairs arranged in the center. A coffee maker sat on a side table, a fresh pot brewing. "Please make yourselves comfortable," Harrington said, gesturing toward the couch. "I'll inform the medical team that we've located you." Jack helped Emily to the couch, where she sank down gratefully. The color had drained from her face during their short walk, and her breathing had become more labored. Despite his suspicions about Harrington, Jack was increasingly concerned about her condition. "I'll get you some water," Jack told her, spotting a water cooler in the corner. Harrington moved toward the door. "I'll step outside to make the call. Better reception." He paused, looking directly at Jack. "Thank you for helping Miss Chen. The Colonel will be grateful." As soon as the door closed behind Harrington, Jack filled a paper cup with water and brought it to Emily, who accepted it with trembling hands. "Something's not right," she whispered after taking a sip. "My father is overprotective. But this," she gestured vaguely at their surroundings. "This feels excessive." Jack crouched down in front of her, keeping his voice low. "Does your father have security personnel who track you regularly?" Emily shook her head, then winced at the movement. "No. I mean, he worries, especially since my mom died 3 years ago. He calls a lot, wants regular check-ins when I'm traveling. But private security agents? That's new?" Jack's concern deepened. "What about this Agent Harrington? Recognize him?" "No," Emily frowned. "Dad has colleagues who visit sometimes, but I've never met him." Jack stood and moved to the window, pulling the blinds aside slightly to look into the parking lot. He could see Harrington standing beside the black SUV, phone to his ear. The rain had tapered to a drizzle, allowing Jack a clearer view. Something in Harrington's demeanor had changed. His posture was more rigid, his free hand gesturing emphatically as he spoke. "What did you say you were studying again?" Jack asked, maintaining his observation of Harrington. "Environmental engineering. Emily replied, sounding confused by the apparent non sequitur. Specializing in water management systems. Jack let the blind fall back into place and turned to her. Have you been working on anything specific? A project? Research? Anything particularly important or sensitive? Emily's eyes widened slightly. How did you know? I've been part of a research team developing new detection methods for groundwater contamination near military bases. We've found some concerning results. She leaned forward, lowering her voice further. Jack, what's going on? Before he could answer, the door opened and Harrington returned, accompanied by his colleague from the diner. The second man carried a small medical kit. Medical team is 15 minutes out, Harrington announced. In the meantime, Peters here has basic first aid training. He can take a look at that cut. Peters moved toward Emily with the kit. Jack intercepted him, positioning himself subtly between the man and Emily. I've got combat medical training, Jack said evenly. I've already cleaned and dressed the wound once. Peters and Harrington exchanged a glance that lasted a fraction of a second too long. Of course, Peters said, handing the kit to Jack. Just trying to help. Jack accepted the kit and turned back to Emily. As he pretended to examine the bandage, on her forehead he whispered, "When I give the signal, move toward the door." Emily gave an almost imperceptible nod, her eyes showing understanding despite her weakened state. "The bandage needs changing," Jack announced more loudly. "The cut's still seeping." He opened the first aid kit on the small table, quickly assessing its contents. Standard supplies, nothing unusual. "I'll get some clean towels," Peters offered, moving toward the door. Jack waited until he had left before speaking again. "So, Agent Harrington, how long have you worked for Lieutenant Colonel Chen?" Harrington leaned against the wall, arms crossed. 3 years, since his promotion to his current position in counterintelligence. Jack kept his expression neutral as he applied a fresh antiseptic wipe to Emily's cut. The lie confirmed his suspicions. Victor Chen had never worked in counterintelligence. His specialty had been logistics and strategic operations. "That's interesting," Jack remarked. "And what exactly does his work entail nowadays?" "That's classified," Harrington replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Though I'm sure you understand the sensitive nature of such operations, Mr. Callahan," Jack supplied. Jack Callahan, former Marine, served in Afghanistan. Something flickered. In Harrington's eyes, recognition perhaps. Afghanistan. Were you by chance with the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines? Around 2008? The question seemed casual, but Jack knew it wasn't. Harrington was fishing for confirmation of Jack's identity. The fact that he knew to ask about that specific unit at that specific time meant he knew exactly who Jack was, and thought he did. "No," Jack lied smoothly. 4th Battalion, 7th Marines, Helmand Province mostly. Harrington nodded, but Jack could see he didn't believe him. The tension in the room had shifted, becoming almost palpable. Peters returned with several. "Hand towels, best I could find," he said, offering them to Jack. "These will work," Jack replied, taking them. He noted that Peters had positioned himself near the door, effectively blocking the exit. Neither man had made overtly threatening moves, but Jack recognized containment tactics when he saw them. Jack finished applying a new bandage to Emily's forehead, all the while keeping both men in his peripheral vision. "There, that should hold until the medical team arrives." "Thank you," Emily said, her voice stronger now. She sat up straighter, and Jack could see she was gathering her strength, preparing for whatever came next. "So, Mr. Callahan," Harrington said, his tone conversational. What brought you to this particular stretch of highway tonight? Deliveries, Jack replied simply. Medical supplies bound for Memorial Hospital in Greenfield. In this storm? Harrington raised an eyebrow. Most transport companies suspended deliveries when the weather alerts went out. Jack shrugged. Independent contractor. My choice, my risk. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. And it's just coincidence that you happened to find Lieutenant Colonel Chen's daughter on the side of the road? Out of all the drivers who might have passed by, she was found by a former Marine who served in Afghanistan during the same period as her father? The pretense was evaporating rapidly. Jack decided to change tactics. Speaking of coincidences, he countered, it's remarkable that private security agents were able to locate Emily so quickly in a remote area during a massive storm, especially when her phone had been damaged in the accident. Peters shifted his weight, his hand moving slightly toward his jacket. Jack catalogued the movement, calculating angles and distances. As I explained, Harrington said, his voice hardening, we were tracking her phone, standard protocol. And as Emily explained, Jack replied, her father doesn't have security agents tracking her, so who are you really? The atmosphere in the small room changed instantly. Harrington's posture straightened, all pretense of casualness abandoned. I think it's time we drop the charade, Callahan, he said coldly. We know exactly who you are, just as we know exactly what Emily Chen has been working on. Emily looked between them, confusion and fear evident on her face. Jack, what's happening? Jack never took his eyes off Harrington. These men don't work for your father, Emily. My guess is they work for whoever is responsible for the contamination your research team discovered. Harrington smiled thinly. Clever. But it doesn't matter what you figured out. The situation remains the same. He pulled back his jacket, revealing a holstered handgun. We're leaving with Ms. Chen. How this goes for you depends entirely on your next move. Jack assessed the situation rapidly. 2 armed men in close quarters. Emily still weak from her injury. A truck stop full of civilians just outside the door. The odds weren't good, but Jack Callahan had faced worse odds before. In Afghanistan, with Victor Chen, and he had made a promise, spoken or not, the moment he lifted Emily from that roadside. He wouldn't fail another Chen. Well, Jack said, his voice deceptively calm, as he subtly shifted his stance, I guess we're about to find out what kind of move I'll make. The decisive moment. Jack had always known that timing was everything. In combat, in driving, in life, the difference between success and catastrophe often came down to a split-second decision. As he faced Harrington and Peters in the cramped back room of the truck stop, he knew this was one of those moments. You really don't want to do this, Jack said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. We're in a public place. Witnesses everywhere. Harrington's smile was cold, which is precisely why you'll cooperate. You don't want civilians caught in the crossfire, do you? Former Marine with a conscience, your service record makes that clear. The mention of his record confirmed Jack's suspicions. These men had done their homework. They knew who he was, which meant they likely knew about his history with Victor Chen. This wasn't random. It was targeted. My father will know if something happens to me, Emily said, her voice surprisingly firm despite her weakened condition. He'll tear apart whoever's responsible. Peters chuckled. Your father already thinks you've had a tragic accident in the storm. By morning, that will be the official story. Jack watched as Emily's face paled. He needed to buy time, create an opportunity. The truck stop was busy enough that gunfire would draw immediate attention, which meant Harrington and Peters would prefer to resolve this quietly, perhaps with a concealed weapon or by forcing them to leave peacefully under threat. "Let's be reasonable," Jack suggested, slowly raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Emily needs medical attention, real medical attention, not whatever you're planning. Her father has resources, connections. Whatever you're involved in, harming his daughter will bring heat you can't imagine." "Touching concern," Harrington said, "but Lieutenant Colonel Chen's influence has been neutralized. His recent objections to certain military contracts have made him inconvenient to people far above his pay grade." Emily struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. "What are you talking about? My father hasn't mentioned any conflicts at work." "Of course not," Peters said. "Victor Chen is nothing if not professional. He wouldn't burden his daughter with classified disputes over water contamination testing protocols." Jack's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place. Emily's research, Victor's position, these men's interest. It all connected to something bigger than a simple roadside accident. "The contamination at the bases," Jack said slowly. "Your research team found something they weren't supposed to, didn't they, Emily?" Emily nodded, wincing at the movement. "Perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. They're in firefighting foam used on military bases. We found levels thousands of times higher than safety standards allow in groundwater near 3 major installations. But when we submitted our findings, they were classified immediately. My professor was ordered to destroy the data." "But you kept a copy," Jack guessed. "On a flash drive," Emily confirmed. "I was bringing it to my father tonight. He said he'd help get the information to people who would actually do something about it." Harrington sighed dramatically. "And now we've arrived at the heart of the matter. That flash drive, Ms. Chen. Where is it?" Jack watched Emily's hand instinctively move toward her jacket pocket before she caught herself. Too late, Harrington had noticed. "Search her," Harrington ordered. Peters moved forward, but Jack stepped between them. "Back off!" Peters hesitated, looking to Harrington for direction. The momentary distraction was all Jack needed. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the coffee pot from the nearby machine and hurled the scalding liquid at Harrington's face. Harrington screamed, hands flying up to protect his eyes. Jack instantly pivoted, driving a precise strike to Peter's throat before he could draw his weapon. Peters staggered back, choking and gasping for air. "Run!" Jack shouted to Emily, pushing her toward the door. Emily didn't hesitate. Despite her weakened state, survival instinct took over as she wrenched open the door and stumbled into the diner. Jack followed close behind, pulling the door shut and jamming a chair under the handle to buy them precious seconds. The main diner area was still occupied with truckers and late-night travelers, all of whom looked up in surprise at their sudden emergence. Jack kept his voice low as he guided Emily toward the exit. "Act natural. Don't run. Don't draw attention." A crash from the back room indicated that Harrington or Peters had recovered enough to attempt pursuit. Jack quickened their pace slightly, keeping his body between Emily and the private room door. The waitress behind the counter called out, "Everything all right back there?" "Fine," Jack replied, forcing a casual smile. "Just knocked over the coffee pot. Sorry about the mess." They were nearly to the main entrance when the private room door burst open. Harrington emerged, his face red and blistered from the coffee, eyes wild with rage. Several patrons gasped at his appearance. "Stop them!" Harrington shouted, reaching for his concealed weapon. the diner erupted into chaos. Customers dove for cover, overturning tables and chairs. The waitress screamed, ducking. Behind the counter, Jack shoved Emily through the front door, following immediately after. "My truck!" Jack ordered, guiding her toward his rig parked at the far end of the lot. The rain had almost stopped, but the pavement was still slick, reflecting the neon lights of the truck stop. They had covered half the distance to the truck when a gunshot cracked through the night air. A bullet ricocheted off the asphalt near Jack's feet. "Keep going," he urged, pulling Emily behind a parked SUV for momentary cover. Through the vehicle's windows, Jack could see Harrington standing in the doorway of the diner, gun raised. Peters had joined him, also armed now. Both were scanning the parking lot, looking for movement. Jack assessed their options. The truck was still 30 yards away, with minimal cover between their current position and its relative safety. In Emily's condition, a sprint across open ground with armed pursuers was a deadly proposition. "We need a distraction," Jack whispered. Emily reached into her pocket and withdrew a set of keys with a small remote fob attached. "My car keys," she explained. "If my car's somewhere nearby, I can trigger the alarm." Jack weighed the risk versus reward. If her car was close enough, the alarm might draw Harrington and Peters' attention momentarily. If not, pressing the button would accomplish nothing but potentially give away their position. "Worth a try," he decided. "On my signal, press it, then we move immediately toward that row of trucks." He pointed to a line of semis that would provide better cover for their approach to his vehicle. Emily nodded, thumb poised over the panic button on her key fob. Jack peered around the edge of the SUV, tracking Harrington and Peters as they began to move methodically through the parking lot, checking between vehicles. "Now," Jack whispered. Emily pressed the button. For a second, nothing happened. Then, from the far side of the parking lot, a car alarm began to wail. Lights flashed on a small sedan partially hidden by larger vehicles. As hoped, both Harrington and Peters turned toward the noise, momentarily distracted. Jack seized the opportunity, pulling Emily alongside him as they crouched low and moved quickly between the parked vehicles toward the row of semi-trucks. They had almost reached the first truck when Peters spotted them. "There!" he shouted, raising his weapon. Jack pushed Emily down behind a truck tire as bullets pinged off metal above them. The gunfire had now attracted attention from inside the diner. Jack could see people at the windows, and someone was shouting about calling the police. "Stay down," Jack instructed Emily. "I need to circle around. When I create an opening, run straight for my truck. The keys are in the ignition." "What about you?" Emily asked, her face pale but determined. "I'll be right behind you," Jack assured her, though he wasn't certain he could keep that promise. Before Emily could object, Jack slipped away, using the trucks for cover as he circled back around. His goal was simple: flank Peters, neutralize the immediate threat, and give Emily a clear path to the truck. If they could reach it, the reinforced cab would provide temporary protection until they could drive away. Jack moved silently between vehicles, relying on skills honed during night operations in Afghanistan. He could hear Harrington and Peters communicating, coordinating their search. They were professionals, but they were also injured and angry, a dangerous combination that often led to mistakes. Peering beneath a truck, Jack spotted Peters' feet. As he moved cautiously between the rows of vehicles, Jack timed his breathing, waiting for the perfect moment. When Peters passed the rear of a pickup truck, Jack made his move. He emerged from cover in complete silence, closing the distance in 3 rapid strides. Peters sensed him too late. Jack struck with precision, a crushing blow to the man's gun. hand followed by a swift strike to the base of the skull with his elbow. Peters crumpled without a sound, his weapon clattering to the wet pavement. Jack quickly secured the gun, tucking it into his waistband. One down, one to go. But before he could locate Harrington, a scream pierced the night. Emily's voice, filled with terror. Jack sprinted toward the sound, caution abandoned in favor of speed. He rounded a large delivery van to find Harrington with his arm around Emily's throat, gun pressed to her temple. Her eyes were wide with fear, hands clutching at Harrington's arm. "Drop the gun, Callahan," Harrington ordered, his blistered face contorted with rage. "Or I paint the pavement with her brains." Jack slowly raised his hands, the confiscated gun dangling from his index finger. "Easy. Let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about. Put the gun down and kick it away." Jack carefully bent to place the weapon on the ground, then kicked it toward Harrington. It skittered across the wet pavement, stopping several feet from them. "Now the flash drive," Harrington demanded. "The one in her pocket." "Emily," Jack said calmly, "give him what he wants." Emily hesitated, then slowly reached into her jacket pocket with trembling fingers. She withdrew a small black flash drive, holding it up for Harrington to see. "Toss it here," Harrington instructed. Emily complied, throwing the drive in a small arc that forced Harrington to track its movement. In that split second of divided attention, Jack saw his opening. "Emily, down!" he shouted. She instantly went limp in Harrington's grasp, dropping her full weight downward. The sudden movement threw Harrington off balance, his gun hand instinctively adjusting grip. Jack lunged forward, driving his shoulder into Harrington's chest, while simultaneously grabbing for the weapon. They crashed to the ground, wrestling for control of the gun. Harrington was strong and trained, but Jack fought with the desperate intensity of a man who had already failed one Chen and refused to fail another. The gun discharged, the bullet harmlessly embedding itself in a nearby tire. Jack smashed his forehead into Harrington's already injured face. The man howled in pain, his grip on the weapon momentarily loosening. Jack wrenched the gun away, rolling to put distance between them. Harrington scrambled to his feet, blood streaming from his nose, eyes darting between Jack the gun and Emily, who had retreated several steps. "It's over," Jack said, training the weapon on Harrington's chest. "The police are coming. Whatever operation you're running is compromised." Harrington's face twisted into a snarl. "You think this ends with me? The people I work for have reached a... You can't imagine. Military, government, private sector, they're all involved." "Maybe," Jack acknowledged. "But right now, I'm not concerned with them. I'm concerned with you, on the ground, face down, hands behind your head." In the distance, sirens wailed. Someone in the diner had indeed called the police. Harrington heard them too, his expression calculating as he weighed his options. "Last chance," Jack warned. Instead of complying, Harrington reached slowly into his jacket pocket. "Insurance policy," he said, withdrawing a small device with a single button. "Dead man's switch. If I don't enter a code every 30 minutes, everything on that flash drive gets uploaded to several news outlets, along with some less flattering information about Lieutenant Colonel Chen's activities in Afghanistan." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" Harrington smiled, his teeth stained with blood from his injured nose. "Kunar Province. Operation Shadowfall. Ring any bells, Staff Sergeant Callahan?" The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Operation Shadowfall, the mission that had ended his military career and haunted his dreams for 15 years. The operation where he and Victor Chen had both made decisions they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to outrun. "Emily doesn't need to hear your lies," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "Lies?" Harrington laughed. "I have the after-action. Reports, the ones that were buried. I know what really happened in that village." Emily looked between them, confusion and concern evident on her face. "Jack, what is he talking about?" Before Jack could respond, the sound of vehicles screeching into the parking lot drew their attention. Police cruisers, lights flashing, surrounded the perimeter of the truck stop. Harrington's smile widened. "Decision time, Callahan. Let me walk away with the flash drive, or everyone learns the truth about you and Victor Chen." Jack's hand tightened on the gun. The flashbacks threatened to overwhelm him. The village, the intelligence failure, the decisions made in the heat of combat that no one should ever have to make. The consequences that had fractured his life and, he suspected, Victor Chen's as well. But looking at Emily, he saw not just Victor's daughter, but an innocent caught in something larger than herself. Someone who had tried to do the right thing, just as he once had. "Emily," Jack said, never taking his eyes off Harrington, "get the flash drive." Emily hesitated, then moved cautiously to retrieve the small device from where it had fallen during the struggle. She picked it up, holding it protectively. "Now go," Jack continued. "The police are here. Show them your ID, tell them you were kidnapped. Don't mention the flash drive." "But," Emily began. "Go," Jack insisted. "Trust me." Emily backed away slowly, then turned and ran toward the approaching police officers. Jack kept his weapon trained on Harrington, who watched her departure with narrowed eyes. "Bad move, Callahan," Harrington said. "I just need to press this button, and your dirty laundry airs for the world to see." Jack shook his head. "I don't think so. Because if those files were really ready to upload, you wouldn't have needed the flash drive in the first place. That switch is a bluff." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Harrington's face. "Here's what's going to happen," Jack continued. "You're going to drop that device and put your hands up. Then you're going to answer some questions about who sent you and why they're so interested in covering up water contamination on military bases." "I don't think you understand your position," Harrington replied, though his confidence seemed to be wavering. "You're a truck driver with PTSD and a history of questionable decisions in combat. I'm a federal agent responding to a security threat." "Are you?" Jack challenged. "Because I'm betting those credentials are as fake as your story about working for Victor Chen. And I'm betting the real federal agents who just arrived will be very interested in why a supposed government operative was holding a gun to a college student's head." Harrington's eyes darted toward the approaching police. Jack could see the calculations happening behind them, options narrowing, risks mounting. "Last chance," Jack warned. "Drop it and surrender." For a moment, it seemed Harrington might comply. Then with surprising speed, he launched himself forward, reaching for Jack's gun. Jack had anticipated the move. He sidestepped, using Harrington's momentum against him. As Harrington stumbled past, Jack delivered a precise strike to the back of his neck, a technique he'd learned in close-quarters combat training. Harrington collapsed to the pavement, unconscious. Jack quickly kicked away the supposed dead man's switch and secured Harrington's hands with his own belt, fashioning a makeshift restraint. As the police closed in, weapons drawn and shouting commands, Jack slowly raised his hands, letting the gun dangle from one finger. He knelt, placing the weapon on the ground, then laced his fingers behind his head. the truth about Operation Shadowfall might still come to light. The connection between him and Victor Chen would eventually be discovered. But for now, Emily was safe, and the evidence of the contamination was secure. And perhaps after 15 years of running, it was finally time to face the past. The weight of truth. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the small interrogation room of the Greenfield police station. Jack sat with his hands resting on the metal table, his coffee untouched. The clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m. He'd been here for almost 4 hours, patiently repeating his statement to a succession of increasingly higher-ranking officials. Data opened again, and a woman entered, different from the previous investigators. She wore plain clothes rather than a uniform, with a badge clipped to her belt and the weary eyes of someone who had been called in from home in the middle of the night. "Mr. Callahan, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI." She set down a folder and took the seat across from him. "I apologize for the hour and the repetition, but I need to hear your account directly." Jack nodded. He'd expected this escalation once the local police realized the complexity of what they were dealing with. Of course, Agent Torres studied him with practiced neutrality. "You've had quite a night. Finding a young woman on the side of the road, rescuing her from armed assailants claiming to be federal agents, all during one of the worst storms this county has seen in years." "When you put it that way, it does sound unlikely," Jack admitted. "And yet, every part of your story that we've been able to verify checks out," Torres continued. "Emily Chen's account matches yours. The 2 men you subdued were carrying sophisticated forgeries of federal credentials. The truck stop security cameras captured most of the confrontation in the parking lot." "That's what we'd like to know," Torres replied, "because the implications are troubling. If Harrington and Peters had access to classified documents about Operation Shadowfall, and if there's a connection to Emily Chen's research on water contamination, we may be looking at a conspiracy that spans decades and involves high-ranking officials in both military and private sectors." Jack pushed the photograph back toward her. "What do you need from me?" "The truth, Mr. Callahan, about what happened that night in Kunar province, about why it might still matter 15 years later, and about why someone would go to such lengths to keep it buried." Jack had spent 15 years avoiding this moment. 15 years driving his truck across the country, outrunning memories and responsibilities. 15 years telling himself that the past was past. But sitting in this sterile interrogation room, with evidence of that past literally staring him in the face, he knew the time for running had ended. "It was supposed to be a standard reconnaissance mission," he began, his voice low. "Intelligence had reported Taliban fighters using a small village as a staging area for attacks. My unit was tasked with confirming enemy presence, assessing strength and weaponry, then reporting back for a potential airstrike." Torres listened without interrupting, her pen poised over her notepad. "Major Chen was our commanding officer, running operations from the forward base. I led the ground team, 8 Marines, all experienced. We approached the village after dark, maintaining communication with base throughout." Jack's gaze grew distant, seeing not the interrogation room, but the moonlit mountains of Afghanistan. The intel was wrong. There were no Taliban fighters, just villagers, families, children. He paused, taking a sip of the now cold coffee to steady himself. We were about to abort the mission when the shooting started. Not from the village, from the ridgeline behind us. We'd been set up, caught in an ambush between the ridge and the village. 2 of my men went down immediately. Jack's scarred hands tightened around the coffee cup. We called for air support, but it was at least 20 minutes out. We needed to move to find cover. The only option was the village itself. Torres nodded, understanding the tactical situation. We retreated into the village, bringing our wounded. The villagers were terrified, but one of our interpreters explained the situation. They let us use a building for cover while we returned fire against the ridge. Jack's voice grew quieter. That's when the second part of the ambush revealed itself. What happened? Torres prompted when Jack fell silent. One of the villagers wasn't a villager. He detonated an explosive vest in the center of the village. The building we were using as cover partially collapsed. 3 more of my men died instantly. The rest of us were trapped, injured, surrounded by panicked civilians, and under constant fire from the ridge. Jack looked directly at Torres. Major Chen was monitoring everything from base. He had to make a decision based on the information available. A building full of injured American Marines, enemy fighters on the ridge preparing to move in, and now an unknown number of hostile combatants potentially hiding among the villagers. What decision did he make? Torres asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. He called in the airstrike on our position, on the village. Jack's voice was hollow. He determined that the risk of losing the entire unit and potentially having Marines captured by the Taliban outweighed the alternative. And you? I countermanded the order. Jack closed his eyes briefly. When I heard the strike was incoming, I used our emergency channel to abort. I reported that we had secured the village, eliminated the immediate threat, and were treating civilian casualties. None of which was true at that moment, but all of which bought us time. Torres made a note. That's not in the official record. No. The official record states that intelligence was updated in real time. The airstrike was called off due to civilian presence, and the ground team was eventually extracted after eliminating the enemy threat. Jack's expression hardened. A sanitized version that protected everyone involved, including Major Chen, including all of us. The reality was messier. We did eventually secure our position. We did treat civilians who were injured in the explosion. And when extraction finally came, we brought the villagers who were willing to leave with us. But for about 45 minutes, I directly violated orders from a superior officer during an active combat situation. Because you disagreed with his assessment. Jack shook his head. Because I was on the ground. I could see what he couldn't. The hostile combatants among the villagers turned out to be one suicide bomber who had already detonated. The rest were innocent people caught in the middle of someone else's war. And after there were debriefings, reports, questions about my decision-making, Major Chen and I reached an understanding. He acknowledged that my actions saved civilian lives. I acknowledged that his decision, based on the information he had, followed protocol. Neither of us formally accused the other of wrongdoing. But you never served together again, Torres observed. No, I was injured in the extraction, bullet through the shoulder, shrapnel damage, enough to send me stateside for recovery. By the time I was cleared for duty, I had decided to accept the honorable discharge I was offered. Major Chen continued his career. Torres tapped her pen against the folder. And now, 15 years later, someone is threatening to expose what really happened. It appears so. The question is why? What does a classified operation from 2008 have to do with water contamination research in 2023? Jack leaned back in his chair. Maybe nothing directly, but think about the larger picture. Emily's research threatens to expose negligence and cover-ups related to military-based contamination, potentially billions in liabilities, criminal charges, for those who knowingly concealed the dangers. And Shadowfall? Leverage, Jack said simply. If Chen is now in a position to help expose the contamination, Shadowfall gives them control over him. The threat of revealing his original call for that airstrike, a decision that would have resulted in significant civilian casualties, would be enough to silence most men. Torres considered this. And you? Where do you fit in their calculations? Insurance. Perhaps. Or maybe they didn't expect me to be involved at all until Emily ended up in my truck. After that, they had to improvise. Jack frowned. But that still doesn't explain how they got access to classified reports about Shadowfall in the first place. That information would have been highly restricted. Unless someone with access provided it, Torres said. Someone with a vested interest in both keeping the contamination secret and maintaining leverage over Colonel Chen. The implications hung in the air between them. Someone highly placed in military or governmental circles was orchestrating this. Someone with the authority to access classified operations, the influence to suppress scientific research, and the resources to deploy convincing fake federal agents. What happens now? Jack asked after a moment. Torres gathered the papers back into her folder. Now we locate Colonel Chen. We secure the evidence Emily collected, and we identify whoever is behind this operation. And me, you'll remain in protective custody for the time being, as will Ms. Chen. You're both material witnesses in what has become a federal investigation. Torres stood, tucking the folder under her arm. Get some rest, Mr. Callahan. I suspect the coming days will be demanding. As she reached the door, Jack called after her. Agent Torres, there's something I didn't include in my statement earlier. She turned back, eyebrow raised. When I first found Emily and checked her ID, I recognized her father's name immediately. I could have left her there, called 911 and continued on my route. No one would have questioned it. But you didn't, Torres observed. No, because whatever happened between Victor Chen and me 15 years ago, I owed him better than that. Jack met her gaze steadily. We all make impossible decisions in impossible situations. I've had 15 years to think about what happened in that village. 15 years to wonder if I would have made the same call Chen did had our positions been reversed. And what conclusion did you reach? Jack's expression was solemn. That judging others without standing in their shoes is the easiest and most dangerous thing in the world. And that sometimes the only way to make peace with the past is to face it head on. Torres nodded thoughtfully. Get some rest, Mr. Callahan. I'll return in a few hours with news about Colonel Chen. After she left, Jack remained seated, staring at his reflection in the two-way mirror on the wall. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to fully remember the events of Operation Shadowfall. Not just the sanitized version he'd reported, but the raw, unfiltered reality. The fear, the chaos, the weight of lives balanced on split-second decisions. And he wondered if, after all this time, he might finally find a way to put those ghosts to rest. The unexpected reunion. Jack dozed fitfully in the holding room where he'd been moved after his interview with Agent Torres. It wasn't a cell. The FBI had been clear that he wasn't under arrest, but it wasn't exactly comfortable either. A narrow cot, a small table, and a chair constituted the entirety of the furnishings. The door remained unlocked, but a uniformed officer stationed outside made it clear that protective custody meant staying put. He was awakened by a gentle knock. The door opened to reveal Agent Torres, looking marginally more rested than when he'd last seen her, though the shadows under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "we have news." Jack sat up, instantly alert. "About Chen?" "Yes, and it's better if you hear it directly." She stepped aside, and another figure entered the room. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Chen wore civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt under a dark jacket, but his military bearing was unmistakable. At 53, his hair had gone mostly gray, and lines had deepened around his eyes and mouth. But Jack would have recognized him anywhere. The man who had once commanded his respect, then his resentment, and finally his grudging understanding, stood before him for the first time in 15 years. Jack rose slowly to his feet, unsure of the proper protocol for this unprecedented situation. "Staff, Sergeant Callahan," Chen said, his voice exactly as Jack remembered it, calm, measured, authoritative. "Just Jack now, sir," he replied automatically. A ghost of a smile touched Chen's lips. "And just Victor, I think." Under the circumstances, Agent Torres cleared her throat. "I'll give you two a moment to talk. Colonel Chen has been fully briefed on the situation. We located him at Fort Benning, not overseas as we were initially told." She gave Chen a pointed look before stepping out and closing the door behind her. For a moment, neither man spoke. 15 years of silence, of carefully maintained distance, created a chasm between them that seemed impossible to bridge with mere words. Finally, Chen took a step forward. "I understand I owe you a debt of gratitude for helping Emily." Jack shook his head. "Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true." Chen's gaze was direct, unflinching, especially given our history. Jack gestured to the small table and chairs. "Should we sit?" Chen nodded, and they both took seats on opposite sides of the table. The familiarity of the positioning, like countless mission briefings and debriefings they'd shared, was not lost on either of them. "Emily?" Jack asked. "How is she?" "Recovering. The concussion was mild, fortunately. She's resting under guard at the hospital." Chen's expression softened momentarily at the mention of his daughter, then hardened again. "Agent Torres tells me you were quite explicit about Operation Shadowfall in your statement." "I had little choice. The men who came after Emily had detailed knowledge of the operation, knowledge they shouldn't have had access to." Chen's jaw tightened. "Yes, I've been shown the document they recovered. It appears to be your original field report." "The one I was ordered to rewrite," Jack confirmed. "The one we both agreed needed revision given the circumstances." Chen's tone held a warning. Jack leaned forward. "With respect, Sir Victor, I think we're well past worrying about who said what 15 years ago. Someone is using Shadowfall as leverage, and they're targeting your daughter to get to you. That's what matters now." Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're right, of course. Old habits." He sighed, some of the rigid military bearing leaving his shoulders. "Emily's research. It's causing significant discomfort in certain circles. PFAS contamination near military bases," Jack said. "Seems straightforward enough. Why the extreme response?" because it's not just about current contamination. Emily's team developed a new testing method that can detect these chemicals at much lower concentrations and track them over much greater distances than previous methods. They can also determine approximately when the contamination occurred. Chen's expression grew grim. Some of their samples show contamination dating back to the 1970s. Jack understood immediately. So this isn't just about current liability. It's about decades of knowledge and inaction. Precisely, the Defense Department has officially acknowledged PFAS as a problem only in the last few years. Emily's research suggests they've known, or should have known, for much longer. But why bring Shadowfall into it? What's the connection? Chen's gaze dropped to his hands, which were clasped tightly on the table. Because I've been helping her. Not officially, not openly, but I've been providing her team with access to historical records about on-base firefighting activities, training locations, storage facilities, information that isn't classified but is difficult to obtain, without knowing where to look. And someone noticed, Jack concluded. Yes. About 3 months ago, I was approached by a former colleague, now working for a defense contractor, who suggested quite civilly that I should discourage Emily from pursuing this particular research direction. Chen's expression darkened. When I declined, the approach became less civil. References were made to Shadowfall, to decisions that might look different in the clear light of hindsight and public scrutiny. Blackmail. Indeed, though they called it a friendly reminder about the complexities of chain of command and decision-making. In combat situations, Jack felt a surge of anger. They threatened to expose your call for the airstrike, to paint you as someone who was willing to sacrifice civilians, among other things. Chen met Jack's gaze directly. They also suggested they had evidence that you and I had conspired to conceal the truth about what happened that night, that our agreement to revise the reports constituted a criminal cover-up. The implications were clear. Both their careers, their reputations, possibly even their freedom, could be destroyed if the unvarnished truth about Shadowfall came to light in the wrong context. So what did you do? Jack asked. I appeared to cooperate. I told Emily I was concerned about her safety pursuing such a politically charged research area. I suggested she consider focusing on other applications for her testing methodology. Chen's lips curved in a slight, proud smile. She refused, of course, emphatically. Like father, like daughter, Jack observed. Chen acknowledged this with a nod. When it became clear she wouldn't be deterred, I began helping her more actively. I connected her with journalists I trust, with advocacy groups for veterans exposed to these chemicals, and I started compiling my own file on who was behind the pressure campaign, which made you an even bigger target. Yes, 2 weeks ago I was suddenly assigned to an advisory role for a training exercise at Fort Benning. My security clearance was temporarily restricted for routine review. My access to certain databases was suspended, all perfectly normal. Procedures on paper, but actually designed to isolate you, Jack concluded. Exactly. And then Emily stopped answering my calls yesterday. Chen's composed exterior cracked slightly, revealing the worried father beneath the military officer. When I couldn't reach her, I knew something had happened. I was making arrangements to go AWOL, if necessary, when the FBI located me. Jack absorbed this information, the pieces falling into place. So now what? Torres mentioned a federal investigation. But if these people have the reach you're describing, the investigation is real, Chen assured him. Torres is part of a joint FBI-EPA task force looking into PFAS contamination and potential criminal negligence. Emily's research is key evidence. And now, with the attempt to abduct her and the connection to classified military operations, the IT scope has expanded significantly. Jack nodded slowly. And us? What happens to us now? Chen met his gaze directly. That depends partly on you, Jack. On what you want to happen. For 15 years, Jack had carefully avoided thinking about what he would say to Victor Chen if they ever met again. He had constructed and demolished countless conversations in his mind during long nights on the road, but facing the man in reality, none of those imagined scenarios seemed adequate. I want, Jack said carefully, to stop running from Shadowfall. From all of it. If that means testifying about what really happened, I'm prepared to do that. Chen studied him for a long moment, even knowing the potential consequences. Even then, Jack leaned forward. Those men were willing to hurt your daughter to keep this quiet. That changes the equation. A knock at the door interrupted them. Agent Torres entered, her expression serious. Gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation. The two men in custody, Harrington and Peters, they're gone. Jack stood abruptly. What do you mean, gone? 2 U.S. Marshals arrived an hour ago with transfer papers. By the time we verified the papers were forgeries, Harrington and Peters had disappeared, along with the supposed marshals. Chen's face darkened. And the flash drive? Emily's research. Secure, Torres assured him. We've uploaded the data to multiple secure servers as a precaution. But this development confirms our suspicions about how high this goes. Very few people could orchestrate a false transfer from federal custody. Jack and Chen exchanged looks, the implications clear. Their past and present had collided in ways neither could have anticipated, binding them together once more in a fight against forces that operated in the shadows of power. We need to move you both to a more secure location, Torres continued, along with Emily once she's cleared for transport. A safe house has been prepared. As they prepared to leave, Chen turned to Jack. Whatever happens next, I want you to know something. What you did that night in Kunar, countermanding my order, it was the right call. I've had 15 years to think about it, and I would make a different decision today. Jack nodded, a weight he'd carried for years, lifting slightly from his shoulders. And I've had 15 years to understand why you made the call you did. We both did the best we could with what we had. Chen extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Jack took it. Some debts could never be repaid, some wounds never fully healed. But sometimes the simple acknowledgement of shared burden was enough to forge a path forward. As they followed Agent Torres from the room, Jack realized that his long journey, the one that had begun in a distant village and continued across countless highways, had been leading him here all along. Not to an ending, but to a new beginning. The road ahead. The safe house was a modest cabin nestled in the foothills, 40 miles outside of Greenfield. Surrounded by dense woods and accessible only by a single gravel road, it offered both seclusion and defensibility. As they approached in an unmarked FBI vehicle, Jack observed the tactical advantages of the location. Clear sightlines in all directions, multiple potential evacuation routes through the forest, natural barriers that would slow any approaching vehicles. Standard bureau retreat, Torres explained as they pulled up to the cabin. Off the books, rotated irregularly. Only a handful of people know about this location. 2 agents were already on site, one visibly patrolling the perimeter while another monitored surveillance equipment inside. As they entered, Jack noticed the cabin's rustic appearance belied its sophisticated security: reinforced doors, bulletproof, windows disguised as ordinary glass, and what appeared to be a panic room concealed behind a bookshelf. Emily was already there, seated at a wooden table in the main room. Her color had improved since Jack had last seen her, though the bandage on her forehead remained. She rose immediately when they entered, rushing to embrace her father. "Dad," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Chen held her tightly, his normally stoic demeanor cracking to reveal the worried father beneath. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, pulling back. "Just a mild concussion," they said. Her gaze shifted to Jack, and a small smile formed. "Thanks to Jack." Jack nodded awkwardly, still uncomfortable with gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. Emily approached him and, to his surprise, embraced him as well. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. Just happened to be in the right place," Jack replied, patting her shoulder gently before stepping back. Emily returned to her seat at the table, where papers and a laptop were spread out. "I've been helping Agent Torres compile everything I know about the research and the people who might want to suppress it. And I've been coordinating with my team to track Harrington and Peters," Torres added. "We've identified the fake marshals from security footage. Facial recognition has given us names, but they're almost certainly aliases." Chen studied the information displayed on Emily's laptop. "This goes beyond just military contractors, doesn't it?" Torres nodded grimly. "Based on our preliminary investigation, we're looking at a network that includes defense contractors, chemical manufacturers, high-ranking military officials, and possibly even members of congressional oversight committees, all with a vested interest in keeping the full extent of PFAS contamination hidden. Because of liability," Emily said. "Our estimates suggest proper cleanup could cost billions, not to mention the healthcare costs for affected communities and veterans." Jack moved to the window, scanning the tree line out of habit. "And now that Harrington and Peters have escaped, they know we're connecting these dots, which makes all of you high-value targets," Torres confirmed. "Until we can identify and neutralize the key players, you remain in danger." Chen joined Jack at the window. "They won't stop coming." "No," Jack agreed quietly. "They won't." For a moment, the 2 men stood side by side, silently surveying the landscape, not so different from how they had once assessed terrain in a distant mountain range on the other side of the world. "We can't just sit here and wait," Jack finally said. "Defensive positions only work until they don't." Chen nodded, understanding immediately. "You're suggesting we take the initiative." "I'm suggesting we change the equation." Jack turned to face the room. "Right now, they're trying to suppress information, maintain deniability. They're operating in the shadows because that's where they have the advantage. So we bring it into the light," Emily said, catching on quickly. Jack nodded. "All of it. The contamination data, the cover-up, the attempted abduction." He hesitated before adding, "and Shadowfall." Chen's expression remained neutral, but Jack could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing costs and benefits, risks and rewards, just as he had done countless times in combat situations. "A preemptive strike," Chen said finally. "Remove their leverage by exposing everything ourselves on our terms." Torres leaned against the table. That's a risky strategy. Once this information is public, we lose certain investigative advantages. Not to mention the personal consequences for both of you regarding Operation Shadowfall. Some risks are worth taking, Jack replied. Better to control the narrative than let them use it as a weapon. Emily looked between her father and Jack. Dad? Is that what you want to do? Chen was quiet for a moment. What I want, he said carefully, is to do the right thing. Finally, after all these years, he met Jack's gaze. We've both carried Shadowfall for too long. Maybe it's time to put it down. Jack felt something shift inside him, a loosening of a knot that had been tight for 15 years. I'm ready if you are. Torres studied them both. If we do this, we do it right. Full protection, coordinated releases through multiple channels, ironclad documentation. No room for spin or deniability. I have journalist contacts, Emily offered. People who've been investigating PFAS for years. And I have the full Shadowfall file, Chen added. Not just the reports, but my personal records, communications, everything. As they began to formulate a plan, Jack felt a strange sense of coming full circle. 15 years ago, in a village half a world away, he and Victor Chen had made choices that altered the courses of their lives. Now, those divergent paths had converged again, offering something neither man had expected to find, the possibility of redemption. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage, redemption, and the unexpected connections that shape our lives. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories that remind us of our common humanity. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of listeners who believe in the power of storytelling to change hearts and minds.